Hi guys. So I'm trying a new format for this. I'm not really happy with the way it's looking, but I'm going to try it anyway. I'm recording this on Zoom so that I can see if I can post it that way. But in the previous lecture, I talked a lot about uh, I went over the different ethical theories, constructs that we can use. Um, and then began to give you some definitions, in particular about justice, rights, liberty, paternalism. And I defined also justice, and I gave you two examples or two types of justice that we often think about, retributive justice and distributive justice. Okay, so taking that conversation a little bit further, um, it's commonly believed that we as Americans live in what is called a meritocracy. So, in other words, um, if you work hard, if you really try, um, you can achieve virtually anything. Um, the old Horatio Alger, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Um, you can overcome. That's what we hear in the American culture. One has to begin to ask, is that true? Is that correct? Now there might be some of you who are viewing this portion of the lecture, and you say, "Well, of course it is. Look at my parents. Look at me. That's what I've done." Um, but I would bet there are a lot of you who say, "Oh, hell no. That is not the culture, and that is not the America in which I live. That is a fantasy." Um, what we find when we carefully examine the statistics about how this breaks down is we find that very often uh, people of certain socioeconomic, certain racial and ethnic minorities have much more trouble, if you will, quote, getting ahead. And I put that in scare quotes there. They have much more trouble getting ahead. Um, and sometimes that is simply because of what um, what society, the systems that society has set in place. And so we're in the midst of seeing this right now. If you look um, at the protests that have happened in recent months about Breonna Taylor, about George Floyd, and others, those are not just protests about police brutality, police killing Black people. It is that, but it's more than that as well. It is protesting what many in a minority community would see as a two-tiered system. So not only is the justice system um, uh, skewed disproportionately against minorities, and we see that with with recent protests of those deaths. But there's also a corresponding um, uh, subtext to this, saying that we live in and we operate in a systemically unjust, uh, unequal society, so that inequality plays itself out then with a disproportionate number of people of brown and Black skin having interactions with the police. And to some extent, that's an indictment saying that the system is against poor people. The system is stacked against poor people. And so when we are talking about the idea of justice. We cannot separate it, at least in the American context, from questions about civil rights and questions about race. It just can't be done. Now, the reason I'm doing this on Zoom is because I want to try something. So I'm going to pause this and see if this works. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share something on my screen here. I believe you can see that now. Yeah, you are screen sharing, and this is what I'm sharing. So one of the links that I'm going to put in here to put up on your course module for this section is going to be this. This is a white privilege test. Now, I know you're saying, I'm not white. That's okay. I want you to take it anyway. And I'm going to ask you all to post your score. Don't tell us your race, but post your score. If you want to tell us your race, you can. But I'm asking you to answer honestly. Now, yes, this is one that was formulated for the UK and Scotland. It doesn't really matter. You can take the test anyway. And so what I want you to do is just go down through here and informally jot down your score. And it gives you instructions. And there are various versions of this, but this is one that I kind of like. And then I want you to follow the instructions. And then it also gives you some things to think about here after you've taken this white privilege test. I'm going to stop my share now. Go back. So I'd like you to post. So there will be a link so that you can take this, and then there will be a discussion question. Please post your scores. Even if you don't post your race, as long as everybody's answering honestly, I bet I can guess your race. I bet I'll be able to based on the scores. The point that I'm trying to get you to see, or that I hope that you will see, I'm not telling you how to think. I'm just telling you that there is an implicit bias in the system. There is systemic racism in the US. And the thing about it is, and as I've studied race and implicit bias, the best thing to do when someone says to you, that's racist, is to stop and say, okay, explain it to me because I need to learn this. And so I would encourage you to call out explicit racism or implicit racism when you experience it, when you see it, even if you're white and you hear somebody else say something racist. If they tell an off-color joke, maybe that's even troublesome. Now, I'm not talking about taking it to a certain, okay, I'm going to state this, and this is going to sound racist. I'm not talking about taking it to extremes, saying you can't use a term like master bedroom because the term master connotates slavery. Indeed, you might get to that point. You might find that you're more comfortable not using that, and you want to call it the primary bedroom rather than master bedroom. And I'm also not talking about the other extreme where you hear somebody explicitly using the N-word. But I'm more so asking you to just think about this and call it out when you see it. Call yourself out. The best antidote to racism and to becoming an anti-racist is to call out racism, even yourself. Here's what I've learned from my anti-racism training. I'm racist. I grew up in the deep South, um, at in Mississippi, in a place where it was all around, but nobody talked about it. Black people didn't talk about it, nor did white people talk about it. They even made a movie about the hometown in which I was born, Mississippi Burning. I'd encourage you to watch it sometimes. It's about the murder um, of three civil rights workers who traveled to Mississippi, Swimmer, Cheney, and Goodwin. Um, um, Two of them were white. One of them was a black civil rights worker, but they were killed, and they were buried uh, not far from where I grew up. In fact, I could be to the place where they were buried very quickly. Um, I could tell you how quickly, but you know, but not once going through high school was that ever spoken of. I grew up in the high school in which I grew up. We had a homecoming queen and a homecoming king. Yeah, not unusual, right? Except um, for years, it had been a white homecoming king and queen, and a black homecoming king and queen, and a white homecoming court and a black homecoming court. And if you look in my yearbook from my senior year of high school, and I'm not that old, you can see that for every position where you elected a white person to, say, student body, there was a black person. In fact, in most of our elections, because they were overwhelmingly white, there was a second vice president. And unless, if a black person was elected to be president or vice president, which wasn't going to happen, then if a black person was elected, you didn't have to fill the second vice president. But because everyone knew that a black person would never be elected, we always had to elect a black second vice president of our student body. And that happened all the way from first grade all the way up to senior year. That didn't stop until about the year 2000. That's 20 years ago. So while I was in high school, while I was in elementary school in that town, that was still going on. And you say, well, that's so explicit. Yeah, but what do you do then about the son of the Confederacy statue that's on the courthouse lawn? It's a small, tiny little courthouse, but you can't walk into the courthouse, especially in the main entrance, without passing underneath that Confederate monument. Quick story, something that happened, true story. So I've lived out of the South longer now than I lived in the South, in the deep South. I did live in Tennessee for a couple of years, but I've been, away from even Tennessee for 20 or 21 years now. So I go back to visit my family on a fairly regular basis, at least once a year. I go back to visit my folks, my brother. On a recent visit, this was probably 4 or 5 years ago, I got up and I was going to breakfast with my dad. He and a bunch of the other old men, they go to a particular fast food place to get breakfast most every morning. Get a biscuit, drink your coffee, sit around, talk about the news of the day, talk about politics, talk about religion, and then get up and start your day. They're all retired, so it's what they do. So I was going to go with my dad to have breakfast, and we went to this fast food place. And it's one of those places where when you pay for your meal, they give you an order number, and then you can go, they give you an empty cup so you can go serve yourself coffee and take a seat and begin drinking your coffee. And then when your order is ready, they'll call your number. Okay, you got the picture? So we had paid for our breakfast, gave us our coffee cups. I walked over to the place where you're supposed to serve yourself coffee. I noticed a scene. I didn't think about it really when I first walked up to it, but there was a 70 something white man, 70 something year old white man with his coffee cup. His arms were crossed. He was sipping his coffee, standing propped up in front of the place where you serve yourself coffee. In front of him, this 70 something year old white man was a black man. He too had his coffee cup, but it was empty. He had paid for his coffee, but he had not served himself coffee yet. And the reason he had not served himself coffee is because the white man was blocking the coffee, and he was looking the black man up and down. And as he sipped his coffee, he said, "You want to get your coffee, don't you, boy?" He only moved because we walked up. And I don't know if there is a look. I don't know how you can necessarily tell, but I don't look like I'm from there anymore. And so he moved away from the coffee. The black man went up and got his coffee, and we got our coffee. I have to tell you, I teach this stuff. I was virtually paralyzed because in that moment, I wanted to say something. I wanted to say, "You bastard, get out of the way. Let that man have his coffee." But I also thought in that moment that if I do this, if I say something, I get to leave tomorrow morning. I'll be back on a plane up north. My dad will have to come here for breakfast, and he'll have to answer for my actions. Fortunately, the old white guy moved. You say, "Well, that's the Deep South." Yeah, but you know what? I've seen race when you witness it so explicitly in the Deep South, you learn to recognize it in its subtle forms when you see it every other place. And I have seen it. I'm white. Even with my eyes, I don't always notice it, having grown up in that culture. But I'm sure there are minorities in this class who have seen it all over. They've experienced it all over. So what I want you to do is I want you to take the white privilege exam. I want you to think about that, do the rest of the work, take the white privilege exam. And then next week for the next lecture, we'll begin to talk about some of these other issues about immigration. We'll say a little bit about that, but I want to spend especially some time on issues of capital punishment. So, we'll talk a little bit about immigration, slavery, but then I want to get to capital punishment and talk a little bit about that. So, take the time, do the work. You'll see where to post your scores. All right, Kane, thanks so much.